The first thing I want to say is, and I just want to read out this because I typed it up to try and make it as clear as I can in order to frame this particular interview. So, from my perspective, and I'm also aware that Graham agrees with this perspective, the object of this Thinking Centre event taking place here in Tipperary in Ireland is not to argue for or against, for example, pro-censorship or anti-censorship, pro-Russia or anti-Russia, pro-vaccination or anti-vaccination, etc., etc. It is to explore something that has its own crucial standalone significance, which is the huge crisis of the amount of unjustified censorship, especially hidden censorship, that is taking place in the world, which is actually increasing the amount of disinformation, misinformation, and malformation of information that is manipulating and controlling the thinking of very many people without them having the opportunity of becoming aware of this. One of the values of this event can simply be to allow people to become aware of facts they may not yet be aware of, and to then make up their own minds. After the interview with Graham has more or less come to a conclusion, we then want to create some space for questions that can be put in the chat. So any questions or statements or anything anybody would want to write, they're very welcome to do that. From my perspective as well, when the pandemic started in 2020, I was flabbergasted from its very beginnings to observe the extraordinary level of censorship that was occurring, whereby I could understand conspiracy theories that were bizarre and certain crackpots being censored, but I couldn't understand highly qualified experts that really needed to be heard, but appeared to be deliberately not being heard simply because they had a different view than the general consensus. And I was amazed. I was also amazed that the media in Ireland and outside of Ireland, the journalistic media, I was amazed on TV and radio, very important questions were not being even asked. And this really amazed me. So then what happened was, after the 3 years, then one of the next crises that comes along is the invasion, Russia's invasion into Ukraine. But once again, I'm noticing that the narrative that's being created is incredibly lopsided, and people who have reasonable views to share were being censored. So I was wondering, so the same dynamics that had occurred in the pandemic, as far as I could see, were now repeating themselves in the Ukraine war. And so then I was wondering, there has to be something going on behind the scenes, or some influence that's somehow contributing to this. And after the event that our last Thinking Centre event here in Ireland, which was Ukraine, the why of Russia's invasion, the why behind Russia's invasion. The following day, by chance, I came across an interview Graham was giving on YouTube. And I was intrigued because he was proposing something that I wouldn't have considered, that was having an influence. And where I mentioned one of the values of this event can simply be to allow people to become aware of facts that they may not yet be aware of, and to then make up their own minds. What I was also intrigued by, especially when I bought Graham's book called Trutophobia: How the Boomers Broke Journalism, I was amazed at the amount of facts that I had not been aware of myself that seemed to be important to be aware of within this whole context of this extraordinary worldwide censorship that was spreading like a virus. So I can't stress strongly enough that Graham's book is really, really an important book in my view. It's not that I'm suggesting it's the be all of everything and totally explains everything. But what it does do is it shares an awful lot of really important facts that are obviously relevant to the whole exploration into this issue of censorship. And he also has a very original idea about what's at work. So I just want to then read out a short piece to give you an introduction to Graham. Dr. Graham Majin is the author of the recent, very insightful book, Trutophobia: How the Boomers Broke Journalism. He worked as a broadcast journalist and senior producer for more than 20 years, and 14 of those years was at BBC News. His inside knowledge gives him a unique insight into how journalists think and how news is produced. He is the author of magazine articles, academic papers, and book chapters on the subject of how the concept of journalistic truth has changed over time. Currently, he is senior lecturer in documentary at Bournemouth University in the UK. He lives in Dorset in the sunny south coast of England. So to start Graham into this, sharing some of his ideas, what I'd like to ask you, Graham, to start with is, you make this distinction between Victorian liberal journalism and boomer idealism journalism. And maybe to start with, you might just say some things about that, because it was a new concept for me to have heard when I read your book.
Yeah, sure. Well, Eddie, thank you so much for that very kind and generous introduction. So I think, I started off from the same place that you've described, and you've described it very well. And the way I put it is that journalism is broken. There's something wrong. In my view, journalism ought to have one job. It has one job to do, which is to tell us what's going on, to provide us with the kind of raw information, with the facts. Why is that important? Well, obviously, because then we can use those facts to base our decision-making process, whether that's political or just about anything else. We need facts. We need to know what's going on. It's certainly essential if you want to live in a liberal, participative democracy. You've got to know what's going on. And the more I looked at journalism, and I'm speaking, as a bit of a poacher term gamekeeper, as someone who's, spent years and years doing this, it seems to me that the sort of journalism we have doesn't really do that. That's not its prime goal. The prime goal is something else. It's perhaps a journalism, the sort of journalism we have is perhaps aware of its ethical, political responsibilities. Journalists quite often self-censor. There's this idea of narrative, which you've touched on. There seem to be a series of set narratives, and it's the job of most journalists just to kind of cherry pick information and present that information in order to protect and nourish the narrative. So what I did, I kind of looked at historically how we got here and how journalism changed. And when I went back in time, it seemed to me that there was a time which perhaps lasted from the 1830s, perhaps maybe up until as late as the 1950s, with breaks in it for notably world wars and things. There was a time where there was a different type of journalism, where the priority seemed to be telling the truth. And I call that type of journalism Victorian liberal journalism. And then what came afterwards, what I call boomer journalism, or official journalism now, is something which changed, and it seemed that the boomer generation changed it. And I'm a bit provocative in the book title, Eddie. I say how the boomers broke journalism. I'm not here to kind of give the boomers a hard time. We could use the word changed. The boomers changed all sorts of things, hairstyles. Not that I'm an expert on those. But the boomers changed everything: music, morality, everything changed, and journalism changed, and even the way that truth is understood changed. So I'm talking about Victorian liberal journalism. You're asking me, well, what is it? How is it different to what we have today? Well, there are some kind of rules which journalists were trained in, and people were expected to follow this kind of methodology of Victorian liberal journalism. First of all, there was this important distinction, crucial distinction between facts and opinion. And the idea was that the news pages would have facts, and journalists would really work very hard to strip out anything like their own personal biases or their political views. They were supposed to be objective or impartial. That does not mean that Victorian liberal journalism was neutral. Far from it. It was very it was often very, very opinionated and political, but the idea was that you would find all the opinion on the editorial or the leader pages. So there's this distinction between facts, who, what, when, where, how, and on the editorial pages you get why, which was a completely different type of question. And so what's changed, I think, is pretty much that the idea that journalism should keep this firewall between facts and opinion seems to have gone, and it's been replaced with what I call narrative, ethical, political narratives. You mentioned something about the kind of idealistic nature of the boomers. We can certainly talk about that, because I tried to work out, why did this change take place? And I think very briefly, I think the baby boomer generation, which grew up after the Second World War, they grew up in conditions of affluence and what seemed to be ever increasing prosperity, things that they kind of took for granted, and they They look back at the world of their parents and grandparents as one of war and poverty, and mistakes, and they hated anything Victorian, and they wanted something better. I think it's as simple as that. It was very well intentioned, and the boomer generation, I think, was very, very utopian. They were dissatisfied with the imperfections of the old way of doing things. They wanted to sweep everything away, and it seemed to them, especially when they were young in the 1960s and perhaps the early 70s, that they were close to creating what I call boomertopia, you know, a completely different society, society where unhappiness would be abolished, there'd be social justice, all sorts of good stuff was very, very close. And I think the boomers felt you just had to sweep away everything that the Victorians had built, all the bad old stuff of the Enlightenment, reason, logic, all of that really got a bad name, and it was associated with the problems of the bad old world. If we could just sweep it all away, there was a faith that something much better would spontaneously somehow emerge.
And Graham, can I just, sorry to this, I don't want you to lose your train of thought, but I think this might be also important, that what you're going to share anyway. And when you mentioned boomer, because I was a boomer, I was born in 1947. But just to link into what you were just saying there now, I was in university in the 1960s, in the late 60s, when all this surge of what you're talking about entered the culture. And from what you were just saying there now, what I was amazed by in university, I was in university, UCD in Dublin, was that very point you're making, that there was students there was a student revolution taking place all over the world. It also sort of took place in Ireland. And the extent to which, I mean, an example, there was one guy and he was very eloquent, and his father was a doctor, and he would get him up in front of all the students in the big mass meeting room, criticizing his father to an extraordinary extent. So there was an extraordinary arrogance, and I was aware of that. There were some people who weren't arrogant, but there was that extraordinary arrogance. So sorry to bring that in, and just to reinforce what you're saying.
Yeah, no, and I appreciate it. Thank you. I mean, that's a good word, arrogance, and I slightly perhaps prefer the word hubris, you know, which is the ancient Greek word, which means something very, very close to arrogance. But it's a, you know, it's really immaturity, because I think it's very easy, you know, and this is something that I don't want to do, is just say, oh, the boomers, they were, you know, bad people. That would be a stupid thing to say. But I think the boomers were young, and they were idealistic, and they were utopian, and it was certainly well intentioned. But you've used the word hubris, or I've used the word hubris. You know, there's a great quote that I think applies to the boomers, that they suffered from the most terrible of delusions. They believed themselves to be virtuous, yeah, I think there was this kind of disease of certainty that the boomers knew it all, which we all tend to think when we're young. And I think it led to all sorts of things that were unintended consequences. I think it led to a form of tribalism, this view that the kind of generation gap is us against them. All the old people are stupid and bad, and all the young people, our generation is great. And that was a form of tribalism, which I think we're only starting to see. There was an intolerance, I think, which again was well intentioned. You could say it was an intolerance of what was bad, or even kind of evil, because if you believe you're good, and you believe that your tribe knows what's good, you've got this hubris, then you're going to be intolerant of evil. When we move on to journalism, you know, the boomers brought in a new type of journalism, which you see first of all in the underground journalism of the 1960s and early 70s. And it's very instructive, I think, to compare that with the old impartial Victorian liberal journalism, because it's take that off. Because yeah, I mean, there was no attempt to be impartial. You know, it was kind of activism. It was, we know what's right. You know, we want to change the world and make it a better place, whether that's stopping the war in Vietnam or whatever it was. Yeah, the goal of boomer journalism was this ethical political goal, and that superseded telling the truth. So I think that's what's behind it in my analysis, and I think over a period of time, that tree which the boomers planted, which was full of good intentions, has borne a bitter fruit. It's a sort of less kind of moral of unintended consequences, Eddie, I think.
Yeah, and another aspect I notice you bring out in the book is that the culture of the boomers, in the way you're describing this cultural shift that had occurred, they believed that if they all agreed on something, that was right. So the consensus determined fact and truth rather than that was quite an extraordinary insularity, really.
Yeah, I think if you kind of compare the old journalism, Victorian liberal journalism, with boomer journalism, it does seem that there's a different standard of truth. People get a bit confused, you know, people can get confused by that when I say that, because people say, well, how can truth change? I mean, it doesn't sound possible. So it's really, what I'm talking about is perhaps better explained or described as legitimate knowledge. You know, what had been thought of as legitimate knowledge changed. So with the Victorians, it was more like scientific inquiry, or it was more like Sherlock Holmes trying to solve a mystery, or it was more like a criminal trial where you have the case for and the case against. You've got to have both sides. The facts have got to be accurate, but you've got to have this impartiality. And what I mean by that is you've got to hear the whole truth, not just part of the truth. That's the original origin of the word in English, of partial and impartial. And the boomers changed that. What you get is a rejection of that type of debate and dialogue, and you get something completely different, which is a consensus of our tribe. And I refer to that as tribal truth. And I think it's now become accepted as official truth. It's the consensus of good people, ethically, politically good people, experts. But it's very much the consensus. And the Victorians tried to get away from that. The Victorians were very kind of scientifically minded and high-minded people. And they wanted to get away from that because they saw that as something very old, something quite primitive and medieval. This idea that our tribe all agrees and that's our truth. And anyone who dissents from that must therefore be an enemy of our tribe. And they should be censored or silenced or punished. So again, I think what the boomers tried to do when they were young, or what they actually did, was they thought they were discovering something really refreshing and new, this idea of a consensus truth. We all feel it. Our generation, you know, we feel passionately that these things are true, therefore they are true, and we don't really want to hear arguments to the contrary. We don't want to hear any arguments in favor of the Vietnam War. One of the guys I interviewed for the book is an academic here, a colleague of mine who was at US University College in the late 60s and early 70s, and had a fascinating chat with him, a bit like your story, Eddie. You know, he said we wanted to tear it all down, and he said he remembers sitting in his living room in the States in 1970 reading the underground press, which had the tribal truth of his generation, the boomers, and his dad was on the other side of the room reading the Milwaukee Sentinel or something, the old-fashioned newspaper. He said you couldn't have a conversation because all his facts were different. his dad's facts are completely different. You couldn't have a conversation about Vietnam or anything political because he had completely different facts. So yeah, I think that the baby boomer generation changed the concept of truth, you know, what philosophers refer to as epistemology. It shifted the idea of what constitutes legitimate knowledge, changed. And that's causing us problems now because we have inherited from the baby boomers in journalism and in politics and in general ideology that of our societies, this idea that what is true is a consensus of the kind of elite or the good. And you mentioned COVID as a kind of case study. And dissent from that is bad.
And that brings back my memory of, you see, the Irish Prime Minister, when COVID was, very much present, he announced on television that the science now had fully confirmed that the vaccination was safe for children as young as 5 years old. And that would have been because he was talking about the science, a consensus. All the experts were now saying this, but they weren't all saying that. There was experts who weren't saying that, but they were censored. And I was struck by also, because it's not that he's not a good person. These people are, in many cases, overworked and trying to do the best they can. However, it was clear to me he didn't understand what the science means. In other words, how could science be already after proving the vaccination was safe for 5-year-old children when it'll be years before the data is available to show whether it is or wasn't? So that would be a statement then that he made, that if Einstein was listening in his grave and saw what that was now being described as science, he would have turned in his grave, literally, but this is what was happening. And none of the journalists were picking up on that or questioning that. You see, I was amazed.
Well, I think that's a really good example because in the case of a new pharmaceutical product, and I'm not wanting to take sides particularly, but there are no experts. There can't be any experts on the long-term safety profile of a new pharmaceutical product because everyone's equally ignorant, and there has to be what I call epistemic humility. We've got to be humble, and as you say, people like Einstein would presumably have been very humble and appalled at the idea that there can be certainty in them, that we can know these things. So that's exactly what I mean by tribal truth, which I think has now become official truth, which is the kind of consensus of the great and good of our tribe, and it leads to censorship. Inevitably, it leads to the idea, well, if we're good and we're motivated by high ethical political motives, we all want to make the world a better place, and if we know we're right, then these other people coming along who are spreading doubt, well they become heretics, and they've got to be silenced. This is another thing I think that's worth saying. I think the boomers, when they were young, they were very, very kind of excited, carried away by this kind of revolution they were waging. They felt they were discovering things that their parents and grandparents didn't know and couldn't experience. What they were rediscovering was a kind of pre-Victorian, pre-Enlightenment way of knowing, this kind of tribal way of knowing. So there were people at the time in the late 60s and 70s who were warning that they were staring, they kind of called the boomers, perhaps somewhat unkindly, barbarians, and said this is like the destruction of civilization. all the restraints on human nature and all the restraints on tribalism that have been built up over centuries in Western liberal societies. People wrote at the time that the baby boomers were tearing all this down and it would have disastrous consequences. Yeah.
Yeah, and just on that subject, which I suppose you used the word there, creative humility, I think. Well, you certainly used the word humility, but in your book, one part of it here, what you mention is,
I think I called it epistemic humility. It's the humility that we don't have certain knowledge. We can't. We're human. We're all fallible. And if I think that was the Enlightenment, and that was the Victorian liberalism took. That was the scientific method. That is science, to be humble about knowledge.
Yeah, in your book, you write that Louis Heron, foreign correspondent of the Times, what he wrote was that recognizing one's own ignorance was the essential first step to producing honest, mature journalism. So that would have been a challenge, I suppose, very much to decide that's emerged.
Yeah, and I think that was one of the assumptions of Victorian liberal journalism, that journalists don't actually know very much, and that there was a kind of responsibility for audiences to understand that too. There was no reason to think that just because it's in a newspaper, it's true. But when was the last time you heard anyone say that on the news, Eddie? You cross over to a correspondent somewhere on TV news, and they say, what's happening and why is it happening? And they're very confident and they're delivering the lines. It's theatre. When was the last time anyone said on TV, I don't know. I don't know what's going on. No one knows what's going on, but here are some facts and here are some opinions. We don't tend to get that. Perhaps it doesn't sell very well. Perhaps it's not kind of commercial.
And the other aspect of that, Graham, too, is that I noticed often on the news, comment is made, say, for example, Ukraine bombed a residential area of Russia deliberately, but they're saying that like they know it as a fact, but it may have come from some Russian source, or much more likely, which has been reported, Russia has deliberately bombed such and such a residential area. And that's apparently the source of that information is coming from the Ukraine side. So instead of an incredibly important boundary, which is it has been reported to us. Once somebody says it is a fact, there's no boundary. But if they say, if I say, Graham has reported this to me, I'm not then arrogantly claiming it's a fact because I don't know.
Yeah, well, that's kind of back to the beginning. I think that's exactly why I say that I argue that journalism is broken. There's something wrong with journalism. And what we get on the mainstream news, what I call official journalism, is this series of narratives. So you mentioned Russia, Ukraine. So the dominant narrative on official journalism, and I'm not saying if it's true or not, I'm just describing what I see, that the narrative is, Russia are bad and Ukraine good. And once you've got that narrative, you then get narrative-led news, which means that the journalism only reports facts. They may be accurate facts, but they only report facts that confirm the narrative. Other facts which are inconvenient and might contradict it are ignored or suppressed or downplayed. There's a whole new industry now, over the last 10, 15 years that's grown up, which I call unofficial journalism. Your podcast, your media that you're making right now, Eddie, would probably be in that category. Anyone who questions or provides the other side of the argument, that is excluded from the mainstream. There's plenty of it around online. It's been made possible by the internet. So it's there for people to see. But it's completely different, and we've got these two completely different worlds. There's the official journalism with its official facts and official narratives, and there's unofficial journalism on, as I say, online with unofficial facts, unofficial narratives, and yeah, we're kind of in a bit of a mess.
And an example of that too would be, because I just want to read a quote from your book as well, and preceding reading the quote, I just want to mention that recently I saw President Biden being interviewed or giving a speech, and he very recently, and he said that very graphically that Russia were totally responsible for the war in Ukraine. The word is totally responsible. But the thing is that one of the things that's really, really gone wrong is when the context of something is being ignored completely, and the focus is just on a specific event. So, but to come straight into what you're saying about alternative voices to what President Biden stated, in one of those alternative voices is Professor John Marshminer, who's very well renowned, would have been on all the mainstream media up to the time he suddenly had said the following, in contrast to what the narrative is about Ukraine. And as you're saying, pointed out there, all I'm aware of is certain facts which I wouldn't have been aware of so much if I hadn't organized that particular thinking center event on Ukraine. And there are verifiable facts. But in any case, from your book, and it might be just interesting to write this out or read this out, Marshminer said, those who believe in facts and logic will quickly discover that the United States and its allies are mainly responsible for this train wreck, meaning the Ukraine war. The tragic truth is that if the West had not pursued NATO expansion into Ukraine, it is unlikely there would be a war in Ukraine today. Washington played the central role in leading Ukraine down the path to destruction. History will judge the United States and its allies with abundant harshness for its remarkable foolish policy on Ukraine. And of course, I'm not necessarily saying that I agree with every aspect of that, but what I do agree with, that something even more central to what he said there, a fact that's even more important. Once he started saying something that was in opposition to the narrative that the American people were hearing and the Western world at large, he was censored from all American mainstream media. Neither has somebody like him being interviewed in Ireland, which I think is quite extraordinary. And the other professor that's also saying similar thing is Jeffrey Sachs, who's also an extremely well-respected professor of international relations. The one thing we can say, where we can't just say that it's a fact what Biden says, or it's a total fact what Marshminer says. What we can say is a total fact that Marshminer has been censored, and so have others. That's a fact.
Yeah, and it's probably worth pointing out, Eddie, that what we're dealing with when we talk about, what the cause of international conflict or a cause of a war is, what we're talking about an opinion, and I think opinions can't be true or false or right or wrong. And it's this is one of the unintended consequences of the changes that the boomers made and the type of journalism we have. Instead of distinguishing between facts, which are true or false, and opinions, which, there are simply different opinions, some of which are more valid than others, and we can accept and reject. It's our right, to kind of believe what we want to believe, I guess. But yeah, that distinction between fact and opinion has really been lost and been replaced by narrative. There are just kind of ethical political narratives. So it's good to believe, certain narratives, and bad to believe the other one. And people who believe the wrong narrative, they're bad people and spreaders of misinformation and hate, and they should be censored. It feels like we're just kind of walking down a road, down a hill, which is not leading anywhere good.
And also, you see, one of the things I feel as well, when there's that type of polarization from, like, for example, what takes place in the political reality of the United States, the Republicans and the Democrats, and of course the same dynamic takes place elsewhere, which means then, once you lock into that tribal way of thinking, as you're saying, then the other side are always 100% responsible for what's happening. But the problem that creates is that responsibility for what's happening then isn't fairly carried by the players who are contributing to the problem. And I'm always intrigued, one of the most extraordinary stories in the Bible, the wisdom that's often there, and I'm not a practicing Catholic. You see, when Jesus says, when they're going to stone the prostitute, let he who is without sin throw the first stone. So it's almost like pointing at something that and apparently I was told by Patrick de Mare, who was one of the pioneers of the new form of dialogue that is of great interest to me. He said that Jesus also said, carry your cross, the burden is light. In other words, if everybody carries their share of the responsibility, these things will get resolved. As long as all the responsibility is lopsided put on one side, and the other side, which owns also a big section of the responsibility, doesn't acknowledge that, the cross becomes lopsided.
Yeah, it's interesting you refer to religion, actually, because if we look historically at this, what I call Victorian liberal journalism, and which came out of the European or Anglo-American Enlightenment, the Western Enlightenment, whatever you want to call it. What came before that, and why did people turn to kind of debate and reason and being tolerant of each other? Well, because what came before that in the 16th and 17th centuries were terrible religious wars in Europe, between Protestants and Catholics and rival Protestant sects and so on. And people were burning each other because they were part of the wrong tribe. And this was horrific. And I think in many ways, sadly, it's the default condition of human beings to revert. I think we revert very quickly to these tribal settings where they're hardwired into us. We've evolved that way over millions of years, hundreds of thousands of years, to be tribal. It's a pretty tough, unpleasant reality to confront, but I think that is the truth. And so the Victorians and the people during the 18th century tried to think, well, is there a better way? Can we stop this? Can we restrain it? And they felt that the way was through things like individual kind of liberty of conscience, respect for the individual belief, allow people to believe what they want to believe, and toleration. I'll tolerate you on condition that you tolerate me. We don't have to agree. We don't have to like each other, but we can kind of get along, perhaps as neighbors. And going back to the journalism, the key thing that you need is truth. You need the truth, and you need different opinions to be tested. It's only when you go down the road of censorship and intolerance, and you believe that you're morally good, and the other people, the other tribe, are morally bad. People who are different and disagree, they're morally bad. That's when you set out on this road to kind of darkness. And as I say, the boomers, I think, innocently and well-meaningly, thought they were discovering something amazing. What they were doing, they were rediscovering these old tribal settings that their parents and grandparents had tried to restrain.
Yes, and another dynamic too that occurs, there was a very prominent Irish journalist, and he was also a television journalist, and he then was very strongly opposing what was taking place in Ireland, in other words. But then he becomes very extreme. So now, lately, I heard him say, when he described the people that are running the country, he described them as scumbags, which means then that he is not aware that that's self-sabotage, because they're not scumbags. And by him saying that, he prevents the possibility of having any sort of dialogue with those people, which means he censors himself from discovering that they're not scumbags. So it's a polarization that tends to occur in that manner, I think, as well. So sometimes people who pretend to be on one side are actually doing more harm. And Graham, just by the way, I heard you recently on another interview, and going back to what you're also talking about, this tendency to encourage people not to think for themselves and believe trust authority. And that extraordinary thing you read out that had occurred in Nazi Germany, be helpful, I think you could.
Yeah, well, I think the context of that was censorship, because we seem to be living in an age of rapidly growing censorship. I believe in freedom of expression, and as much freedom of speech as is, reasonably possible. And we're surrounded by, the EU, European Digital Services Act. And in the UK, here in Britain, the online safety bills become law. In Ireland, you've got new censorship laws going through your parliament, and other principles of censorship being discussed and out for consultation. I think today there was at the end of a period of consultation for the Irish National Counter Disinformation Strategy. All of these things have one thing in common. All of the new censorship laws, they're all motivated, or at least they claim to be motivated, by very high ethical political principles, and the eradication of hate speech, misinformation. That's common with all of these proposals for censorship. I noticed that that's historically true of every type of censorship ever. I found a couple of historical examples. One was from England, actually, in 1662, when Charles II introduced censorship in England, and he said that many evil-disposed persons have been encouraged to print and sell heretical, schismatical, blasphemous, seditious, and treasonable books and pamphlets and papers. And so he introduced censorship to stop any doctrine or opinion contrary to the official doctrine of the church or government. And it was done, he said, to protect people from misinformation. And then I found the other one, which you're referring to, and you have to kind of guess, although I think you've kind of given us a clue. But guess who was the author of this law on censorship? And it says, quote, "Editors must treat their subjects truthfully. Editors must keep out of the newspapers anything which is misleading, offends the religious sentiments of others, or offends a person's welfare, harms their reputation, or makes them appear ridiculous or contemptible." Unquote. I mean, that sounds pretty good. We would all agree with that, wouldn't we? Well, that was Section 13 of the editorial law introduced on the 4th of October, 1933, by Hitler's Nazi party to censor the press. The point being that censorship is always, it seems to me, introduced by people who claim to have, or perhaps they even do have good intentions, but it tends to end very badly.
Yes, and I think also, you see, one of the reasons when I realized that I was watching television and the politicians were telling us what to do, and people were being censored who have different views, and please accept what the authorities are telling you because they know best, and discounting different viewpoints. Straight away, I realized, but if they themselves are functioning in the same manner, which I have no doubt they were, that in other words, if you're on a committee, say, for example, the Irish Medical Committee that was dealing with COVID, which consisted maybe of 20 people, well, it'll censor itself, because if you're there and you're one of 20 people and you now want to say something that's different than the overall consensus, but there's somebody chairing that, a lot of people tend to have a confused relationship with authority, so you will remain silent. And it's interesting because actually Patrick Tamara, who I just mentioned, he discovered from these dialogue groups he was running all those years ago, that he said to me once, if everybody agrees on something, it will be wrong. That's what he said. And the other thing is that on that subject, this individual called David Cantor, he died about 2 years ago in England. And a friend of mine, Peter Garrett, introduced me. Peter Garrett was the founder of Prison Dialogue. He introduced me to some of Cantor's ideas, which are quite extraordinary. And just to quickly say, Cantor had done research in families and groups in the States, and he discovered that there was 4 elements that were necessary for intelligence to emerge out of a group. And in other words, in that group, you needed to have movers, bystanders, followers. And I won't go into too much detail what those mean, but I will go into detail. And you also need opposers. And he discovered without opposers, there's no correction. And he discovered in all these dysfunctional groups, there was never opposing. And opposing doesn't mean I have a big, huge, full-blown argument with Graham and we're suddenly polarized. No, it means I have a view and I say to Graham, you know, Graham, this is something I agree with some of what you're saying, and I disagree with something else, and that's opposing, but there is no opposing. So I realized then that how can I trust the information directions coming from these sources of authority when I already know, and it's not that it's their fault. You see, in a sense, in the universities and elsewhere, this is the sort of stuff that should also be taught, as well as geography and other things. How do human beings communicate together intelligently?
Yeah, no, I 100% agree. And I think it's perhaps the most famous psychologist is Irving Janis, who wrote about groupthink, coined that phrase, which I think is pretty much what you're talking about. The idea that a group of people who get together, they just reinforce their ideas, and it's an explanation for all sorts of disastrous decisions in organizations or even at kind of national level. The idea that people are too frightened to say, this is wrong. Yeah, that's exactly what we're talking about with the idea of tribal truth. Because once you move away from the old Victorian or Enlightenment idea of the case for the prosecution, the case against, the case for the defense. I mean, it's the old Socratic dialogue. If you move away from that back to this tribal truth, which it seems to be where we are, people become too frightened speak up and challenge it, because you're going against the tribe, and and throughout history there have been lots and lots of cases of that's the concept of heresy and the Inquisition.
Yeah, because during the Inquisition you get burnt at the stake, but nowadays you don't. You just lose your job.
Yeah, as the modern
people have lost their jobs. Yeah.
Well, this is the kind of modern digital equivalent of but it's pretty much the same thing. People become too frightened to speak out. There's a great story that comes from Galileo, who ran into big problems with the Inquisition because he was arguing that the sun orbits the earth, whereas at the time the Catholic Church was saying no, the sorry, I got that the wrong way around, haven't I? Galileo said the earth orbits the sun. The Catholic Church at the time said no, the sun orbits the earth. And Galileo, who had invented these state-of-the-art telescopes, invited some very intelligent, highly educated academics or philosophers to look through the telescope. He said, look, just look at the facts, look at the evidence. And they were too frightened. They refused. And they said, we don't want to look through the telescope because the truth could lead to absolutely anything. It becomes dangerous to know the truth when you're in these tribal situations. It's too dangerous.
And as you point out in your book as well, Graham, it becomes dangerous because you discover that you've been wrong, which turns out to be a powerful psychological fear that people have, as if there's something wrong with being wrong. But the belief is there is.
Well, yeah, that can be quite extremely painful, I think, for all of us, for any human being to, we kind of we try and rescue what we believe. We don't, it's very, very painful, very, very challenging to have to reassess, which is why I think the old version, the old defense about that was to be open-minded and say, well, I don't really know. Not for sure. I may be wrong, although I believe this, and this is why I believe this. So yeah.
Yeah, because I'm very humble, Graham. I mean, I very easily admit, and there was one time I was actually wrong. And what had happened was I discovered afterwards that I hadn't been wrong. I was right. I had made a mistake in thinking I was wrong. So that's my humorous contribution to discussion. But it is quite an amazing thing, somehow or another, especially if it's something very deep. I mean, if you're a terrorist, whether it's a Christian fundamentalist or an Islamic fundamentalist, and you're after murdering people, how do you then suddenly wake up to the fact that you were wrong? It would be a very terrifying prospect.
Yeah, that's a very tough one. I think there are no answers to a lot of these things, and I think if everything we've been talking about, Eddie, really precedes the point at which there's real violent conflict, and I think I suppose one of the things that motivates me is a desire for people to avoid killing each other. I think once you reach a certain point along the scale, it's too late, and you lose the ability to reason. You lose the ability to sit down with the other fella and discuss, because you've reached a point of hatred and intolerance and violence where you're in a different world, aren't you? So I don't kind of write about that. I don't think I've got an awful lot to say about that. It's really how we prevent ourselves as human beings getting to that point of darkness and hatred, and bringing it back to somewhere where we can sit down, discuss, debate, and agree to disagree. Or as Voltaire put it, I disagree with you completely, but I'll fight to the death for your right to say it.
And I think a fundamental antidote to descending into that realm of darkness where suddenly all sorts of extraordinary, horrendous conflicts break out is this restriction of facts. You know, facts have their own energy. If somebody has convinced me about somebody that they've done something terribly wrong, it forms in my mind. But now if somebody can give me a fact that's not true, I don't have to change my mind. The fact has already done that. It will have that impact. So this is why censorship is so dangerous, I think, because then it is leading to this disinformation and misinformation. But the people who are given the misinformation, the Irish Prime Minister at the time wasn't aware he was doing that, I felt. It wasn't that he was bad.
No, I completely agree with you. And I think this is the danger. This is why it's so dangerous. And I wonder to what extent, you know, some of the problems we see around the world is you know, caused by the breakdown of journalism and the lack of, you know, this descent into narrative-led news. You know, I don't know exactly what the connection is, but yeah, it seems a descent into unreason back towards just tribal hatreds. And yeah, I mean, people, you know, I mean, none of us are immune from it. You know, if we're being fed misinformation, if we're just getting one side of it all the time, and we never have any awareness that there might be a different side to this, you know, then it would be like having a criminal trial, like someone on trial for murder, and we hear the case against them and we get very angry, you know, and then we say, right, that's it, we've heard everything, let's hang that person. Well, you think, well, hang on, haven't we, you know, shouldn't we just hear their side of it? But you kind of reach a point where I think historically, Eddie, we see this with witchcraft, you know, the witchcraft trials where there'd be some sort of trial and the person would be condemned as a witch. And if anyone wanted to say, just before we burn this person, shouldn't we hear their side of it? Or, you know, isn't there another explanation? People would turn on them and say, why do you want to hear what the witch has to say? Because that will just be giving encouragement to more witches and to Satan and to evil. Why are you doing that? Are you on the side of the witches? So people would just keep quiet. So it becomes very, very dangerous if you just hear one side and you reach this embedded form of tribalism and hatred, and it doesn't lead anywhere good.
Yeah, just on the point of, you mentioned there again, the power of the narrative. And in your book, I just read another section here. The Victorians viewed narrative-led journalism as highly dangerous, the product of theological tribal way of knowing based on faith and belief. Once a narrative became established in the collective mind, it created the illusion of certainty and encouraged intolerance and fanaticism. So you see, I think your book is extremely important because you are presenting an awful lot of facts that people otherwise won't be aware of. And any book that does that, or any conversation that does that, is really, really important. One thing, as we're coming close to where I want to give some time to people to ask questions in the chat, one thing that also I'd like your views on, Graham, there's something extraordinary. I know the dynamics are very powerful in what we're talking about, which they must obviously certainly be, because what is quite extraordinary in one sense is, I mean, the American people currently are believing, there's a big high percentage that believe exactly what the mainstream media tell them, what their government tells them. And of course it occurs in other countries. But the reality is, what surprises me is, it's not that long ago they heard all this at the time of the Iraq War. And they discovered they had been misled, and the media admitted they had let the public down. that's not 100 years ago. That's very recent. The same thing keeps happening all over again. So the power of that, you might like to say something, but if that hadn't happened, you'd be thinking, well, maybe this is the first time it's happened.
Yeah, well, I think what's interesting today, as I've mentioned before, is that we've got this split, and it's excuse me, it's roughly 50-50, I think. You've got about half the population who get their news from official journalism, the mainstream media, but you've got pretty much an equal number who reject that completely, and who reject those narratives, and who get their news from unofficial sources. And I think that's one of the things driving the move to censorship, because people, those in positions of power and authority, are becoming increasingly aware that there's disbelief and skepticism about those narratives. So in a sense, I think, that's kind of cause, arguably, for hope. I don't think people are blindly believing the mainstream news. And that's borne out by survey after survey, not just in the US, but in the UK, in Europe, and I suspect in Ireland as well, of the growing lack of trust that people have in official journalism. So yeah, I mean, there's different ways you can see that. You can see that as a bad thing if people are not hearing, because people are still perhaps not hearing both sides. But I think certainly there is growing mistrust in official sources of news and in institutions generally. Whether that's good or bad, discuss.
Oh, I absolutely agree. And in Ireland as well, I mean, more and more people will turn to the internet. But I wasn't meaning everybody in the States or everybody in Ireland. What I am simply saying, though, and it's not as a criticism, it's more a question: how is it happening? The numbers that still strongly accept what the authorities tell them, and very, very strongly defend that it's intelligent to accept what the experts say without questioning. That given the amount of exposure we've gotten in recent history to the fact that there is clear evidence that is something that maybe we should be not so easily believing. I mean, if you tell me something that's totally wrong, and then I meet you 10 years later and you tell me something and I just totally accept it because you're an expert, but you've already told me something that was terribly wrong and led me to invade Iraq, I'm going to not jump into believing. But that's not saying that there's something wrong with the people who do that. I'm just interested in the forces that create that happening. And often, too, it occurs because people aren't given the opportunity to have these alternative facts. And that's also because most people I find are very intelligent when they get the facts.
Well, I think, Eddie, I think partly, you have to ask what people's goals are. And I think you might be assuming, which some people do, a lot of us do, you're assuming people want to know the truth. But I would challenge that. I'm not really sure that is the case. A lot of people might want to know, well, what should I believe? What ought I to believe? What is it that's ethically, politically good? What will make me, what is the right thing I ought to believe to fit in my place of work or in my community? I want to be thought of as a good person. So I want someone to tell me, what the right thing to believe is. And, we're back to the analogy or the story with Galileo's scientists who refused to look in the telescope because their goal wasn't truth. Their goal was they wanted an easy life. They wanted to be successful. They didn't want to run into trouble with anyone.
Yeah, you see, I think there is quite a chunk of people who, it's not that they want to know the truth. They want to get promoted in their job, maybe. But there are other people, another chunk of people, who are, if they are given facts, can change their minds quite easily. And you end up then, if that occurs, you end up with, in the collective consciousness, what's called a critical mass of people suddenly. And apparently there are percentages once the critical mass is more than 30%. The evidence seems to suggest then the whole of consciousness tends to be influenced by that to some degree. So yes, I certainly don't assume that most people are interested in the truth. It's just that people, I feel, a lot of people can be liberated into discovering more of the truth. And then there are people, because there are other people I find I encounter, and it's almost like it's a wall, no matter how much alternative information comes into the conversation, it doesn't seem to make any difference. So
No, well,
yeah,
human beings are tribal. We're kind of herd animals, aren't we? We kind of want to go along with the herd, and yeah, it can be quite painful to have our beliefs challenged. And a lot of people, I think, want certainty. I think certainty is comforting, and if we're told something, it's nice to just say, "Oh yeah, well that's how it is," because a lot of people don't like uncertainty. And if you're really after truth, you're going to be living in a world of uncertainty a lot of the time. It's not an easy road, I think.
yeah, and just finally then to refer to another part of your book before we go to the chat on that very subject. And I think it's important that I also read out this part. So where you write that Klaus Schwab, I think, called for a great reset. So in the media now you get conspiracy theories about this great reset. But on the other hand, it's important to factually be aware, and you record it in your book, that Schwab, who founded the World Economic Forum in 1971, argues the looming challenge faced by the human race are too complex and confusing to be understood by the mass of ordinary people. They are, he says, beyond the capacity of Victorian liberal democracy to solve. They can only be solved by teams of elite policymakers. So that's also strongly at work. And I've also noticed that I've been in business for a number of business over the years. And I've often found that when I put somebody in authority, they immediately assume that they're more intelligent than those that are reporting to them. It's some sort of a dynamic. And suddenly, the fact is often they're less intelligent.
Yeah, it kind of makes me uncomfortable. I mean, I think people who say, well, you know, the great mass of ordinary people can't know the truth, and you think, well, maybe that's true, but it probably is true. And then say, so the solution is give me the power and wealth, and I'll know the truth for you. You think, oh, hang on a minute, no,
No.
I don't like that. I'd rather, if we've got, you know, the lesser of two evils is, I think, in my opinion, something a bit more democratic. I'd rather everyone had their own views and we're all arguing and we don't know, rather than giving all our kind of power and authority to a tiny group of very, very super powerful aristocrats of, you know, the future. I'm not sure that works for me. It makes me feel very uncomfortable.
And I doubt if it works for anybody on this who's attending this particular event, although I don't want to speak for others, but I speak for myself when I doubt that anybody here in this event would be in favor of that either. And if then, as we are after actually going quite a long time, which is must be having fun when time goes so fast. So if there are any questions in the chat, and Bernard might be able to tell me if there are, I can read them out, and then we can maybe finish up then at that point.
There's nothing in the chat right now, Eddie.
There's nothing in the chat, right? Maybe also, if there's nothing in the chat, maybe somebody may or may not want to say something without going through the chat, and it could be unmuted. On the other hand, if nobody wants to say anything, that's okay as well. So if in any case, it is a long time, I noticed. So, and this particular recording will go on YouTube, especially now that I've been appointed the propaganda minister of the Thinking Centre. I'll make sure it goes on YouTube and elsewhere. And so,
I've got a question from Gerard there, I think, Eddie.
Is there?
Yeah.
Oh, Jerry, you have a question.
Yeah, I typed it up there, but I suppose one thing just regarding the internet and, you know, as you mentioned, when it comes to dialogue and discussion and that kind of wanting to find facts and spending the time on that, that takes effort and time. Has the internet made us lazy? And I know we have the next influence of AI, that if you kind of want to find out something or you're showing an interest in something, you're going to get bombarded with it. But that's maybe a different thing. But are we just accepting what's put in front of us now more than ever?
I think that's a great question. I think when the internet appeared in the late 1990s, there was a lot of optimism. I seem to remember that people thought this was, you know, going to solve problems, and it was going to enable people to challenge the kind of narratives of authority and power. The other point I think that's really important about what you said, Jerry, is this idea of it taking time and effort. You know, it does take huge amounts of time and effort for us to research the other side of the story. But I'm not sure the two are quite the same. I'm not sure the internet has made us lazy. I mean, in a sense, I think the internet is completely neutral. I think the internet's a great way that we can research. We don't have to go to the library or write to people and get their opinions. I think there's millions and millions of pieces of information, innumerable pieces of information out there. It's almost too much, isn't it? I think that's the problem with the internet, is it's like millions of people shouting and screaming. It's very difficult to find things. That's the whole point of search engines. And but we hear, if you've been reading the kind of Twitter files, and all this talk about censorship is designed to limit the efficacy of the search engine, so that we're directed in one direction, not another. So I don't think I can really answer that, but I think you're right to point out that the antidote is effort, time and effort. That you know, and we as the audience have to take responsibility for what we believe. I think that's a really, really good point. We shouldn't just lazily believe everything we read.
Chris has a question.
Thank you.
And if I can
yeah. Sorry, go on, Eddie.
No, Chris, go ahead.
Rory Stewart has just had a book out about politics, and it was serialized in one of the papers, or parts of it was. And I just took a photograph of one paragraph, which was, he was suggesting government might be about critical thinking, but the new style of politics certainly isn't. If critical thinking requires humility, this politics demands absolute confidence in place of reality it offered untethered hope instead of accuracy and vagueness. So he's kind of saying even politics is taking us in this direction as well. And you look at the last 12 years, I mean, we've impressively spat Boris and Truss out, but in America, Trump is still there, and there's something impressive about Britain having, for me, having spat these people out. So something is working, even if we get it wrong quite often too.
Yeah, that's a great quote from the Rory Stewart book. I haven't come across that yet. I'll have to add that to my reading list. Yeah, I think what I write about is focused around journalism. I do briefly sort of talk a bit about politics and the emergence of something called consensus politics, which is a kind of consensus between, collusive politics, which is the idea that journalism should work alongside politicians, to kind of make the world a better place and stress these narratives, and limit dissent, demonize dissent. So I think I write about how journalism became broken historically. I think you could argue absolutely it wasn't just journalism. It didn't happen in a vacuum. A lot of other things changed or were broken. I think you could argue politics became broken. Whether it would probably need a whole longer podcast to talk about the kind of role of populism and exactly what that is and where that fits in. But that's certainly a great quote, and I certainly, insofar as I think a lot of things changed in the last third of the 20th century, and we're only just now starting to see some of the unintended consequences of them. I think there's a lot in that. I really like that quote you read out, Chris.
Yeah, and I do really like it as well, Chris. And going back to Jerry, see, from my experience is that every single thing that manifests has both a creative dimension and a destructive dimension. There will always be both sides almost. So it depends then on how human beings respond to what's manifesting. For example, in 50 years ago, there wasn't the internet. So there is a lot of things going on with the internet that's not particularly at all helpful to where the world is going. And then there's other things going on the internet, which are, for example, without the internet, we wouldn't be having this conversation. I wouldn't have discovered Graham, you see. So I think this lazy aspect that you're talking about, Jerry, is important in the sense that somebody will see something on the internet and it agrees with something themselves that they are totally fully immersed in, and then it reinforces their belief. Like with Trump, what I find, and not just Trump, but you see, it's not only that he's making use of all these followers, I feel, that are shouting and roaring for him, they're making use of him because he's expressing what they really want to express themselves. So both sides are caught in that. And I don't just mean Trump only. But the thing is that, yes, there is that aspect. And there's so many, without, like I say, I can clearly say without the internet, Graham, how would I have heard about you? How would we be having this conversation? How would every one of us be here at the moment? And the same thing occurred with regard to the Ukraine event that we had. So basically, I'm conscious of time, but if anybody else wanted to say something before we close off, that would be very welcome.
No other comment in the chat zone, Eddie.
No other comment in the chat zone. Great. Well, if that's the case, then we can come to an end, and I'm really Oh, Anna Factor wants to know. Oh, sorry, Anna Factor's name came up there. Maybe Anna wanted to ask.
Yes.
Sorry, Anna, yeah?
Yeah.
Yes. Well, it's a bit outside my experience, but it's very interesting, and it raises questions of power dynamics, which something I'm thinking about quite a lot at the moment because of a group that I've been involved in. I'm sorry, I've got a dog that wants to join in. Shh. It made me think very much about when Eddie and Chris and I probably met through David Bone and his interest in starting dialogue groups and being able to talk together in a non-hierarchical way. Obviously, when David was there, people looked to him as an authority, and he tried his best to get into the background so that other people would have a chance to speak together and try out their ideas and try out their thinking. And it could get very hot at times, but we managed, by listening to each other respectfully, we got through it. I mean, I'm thinking of 2 dialogues that we did in Israel with the Bohms and others, Peter and Jenny Garrett, for instance, and people, Palestinians as well as Jews, Arabs and Jews. And as I say, it got very hot, but people had different points of view. And I think that's very important. But of course, in the time of COVID or post-COVID, it's not quite so easy to get together. That's where Zoom and meetings like this are so valuable, where we can share our thoughts. Because as I said, quite a lot of this is new to me, and yet not new in the bigger sense.
I think it's a lovely way to end, Anna. Absolutely kind of beautiful sentiment, really. The idea of, listening respectfully, even though we may disagree or disagree passionately. But I think that must give us hope. What a lovely thought to end on. What do you think, Eddie?
I think a very powerful thought to end on as well, Anna, that you brought in what factually you observed at the dialogues in Israel, given the current state of affairs. It brought out how important dialogue actually is, of course. It's another. So thank you very much, Anna, for that. And as Graham says, I think it's a very good way to end the spirit of what we are doing, which I think has a dialogical dimension to it. And I'd then like to thank everybody who attended, and I'd like to thank Graham for his very, very important ideas and his very important book, because I stress again, I think if you get his book, you will find it is quite original and also quite powerful. So having said that, Graham, thank you very much. And are we going to say goodbye to one another then?
Well, thank you very much.
Goodbye.
Thank you.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you, Graham. Thank you, Eddie.
Thank
Many
you.
thanks.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
All the best. Bye now.